Tonight, the desert is quiet. The last light of the sun has long since slipped beyond the western hills, leaving only a soft glow where earth and sky gently meet. The Nile moves without hurry. Its dark water reflects scattered stars that seem to drift as slowly as the current itself. Along the riverbank, reeds whisper together whenever passes through them. Somewhere far away, a frog calls once before becoming silent again. The air has cooled after another long day beneath the Egyptian sun. Mud brick homes hold the warmth they gathered during daylight, while their flat roofs welcome families searching for the smallest breath of fresh air before sleep. Oil lamps burn with small, steady flames. Their light reaches only a few steps before giving way to darkness. This is a peaceful hour. Most voices have become quiet. Even the village dogs have settled into gentle rest. The donkeys no longer carry heavy loads. Fishing boats are tied safely along the riverbank. The workshops have closed their wooden doors. The smell of fresh bread still lingers in the air, mixing softly with smoke from cooking fires that have nearly burned down to glowing coals. Somewhere inside one of these villages sits a single grain sack. It leans against a cool mud wall beneath a woven reed shelf. Nothing about it appears important. It is made from rough linen, stitched by careful hands many seasons ago. The fabric has been patched several times. Small marks of dust cover its surface. Tiny fibers stick out where the cloth has rubbed against countless shoulders. Inside rests barley. Thousands upon thousands of small grains. Each one looks nearly identical to the next. No king will ever notice this sack. No temple singer will compose songs about it. No monument will remember where it traveled. Yet tomorrow morning, before the first rays of sunlight reach the fields, this quiet grain sack will begin a long journey through the ancient world. Its path will cross farms, villages, workshops, boats, markets, and great cities. It will pass through many ordinary hands. Every person who touches it will quietly depend upon what lies inside. And so, while the world sleeps beneath a sky filled with gentle stars, our story begins beside this humble sack of grain. The village itself is not large. Perhaps only a few hundred people live here. Their homes stand close together, built from sun-dried mud bricks mixed with chopped straw. The walls are thick enough to keep out much of the day's fierce heat. Narrow paths wind between houses, their packed earth polished smooth by countless bare feet and worn sandals. Most families know each other well. Children spend their days running through these same narrow lanes. Women gather water from shared wells or from the river itself. Men leave before sunrise to work fields that stretch far beyond the village. The seasons here follow the great rhythm of the Nile. Everything depends upon the river. When the flood waters arrive, they spread dark, rich mud across the fields. When the waters slowly retreat, farmers begin another growing season. Without this yearly gift, little could survive beneath the endless Egyptian sun. The barley inside the grain sack began many months earlier. Long before tonight. Long before it ever rested against this quiet wall. Its story began as tiny seeds pressed gently into damp earth. The farmer who planted them rose before dawn each morning. He carried a simple wooden hoe across one shoulder while the first birds welcomed another day. His sandals collected cool morning dew from the grasses growing near irrigation channels. He knew every corner of his field. He knew where the soil stayed moist longer. He knew where birds often searched for scattered seeds. He knew which small patches received the earliest sunlight. Nothing about his work changed very much from one season to the next. And perhaps he preferred it that way. Routine brought comfort. The same path. The same tools. The same careful movements. Every morning his hands repeated motions learned from his father, who had learned them from another father before him. The earth accepted the seeds without complaint. Weeks passed slowly. Green shoots appeared. Then taller stems. Gentle winds bent the growing barley until entire fields seemed to ripple like quiet water beneath the afternoon breeze. The farmer watched carefully. Too much water could damage the crop. Too little would weaken it. Some mornings he walked between rows simply to observe. He looked for insects, broken stalks, signs that birds had gathered. Sometimes he spoke softly to himself while working. Not because anyone listened. Only because long hours in peaceful fields often welcomed quiet thoughts. Nearby, other farmers worked their own land. From a distance they looked almost like moving shadows against bright fields. Occasionally one would raise a hand in greeting. Then both returned to work. No conversation lasted very long beneath the growing heat. By midday, the sun became difficult to ignore. Its warmth pressed gently but constantly against every shoulder. Sweat darkened linen clothing. Dust settled onto skin. Even breathing felt slower. Workers often paused beneath the small shade offered by date palms whenever possible. They drank water carried in clay jars wrapped with damp cloth. The water was never truly cold. Still, it brought welcome relief. The barley continued growing. Weeks became months. The green color slowly faded into warm gold. Each stalk grew heavy with grain. When the wind crossed the fields now, thousands of grain heads nodded together like quiet waves beneath a peaceful sea. Harvest time finally arrived. Entire families helped. Children gathered loose stalks. Older workers carried bundles. Women tied sheaves with twisted plant fibers. Simple sickles fitted with small stone blades sliced through the dry stems one careful handful at a time. There was no rushing. Harvest demanded patience. The work continued from sunrise until the light slowly faded. Evenings brought sore backs and tired legs. Yet there was quiet satisfaction as growing piles of harvested barley filled the fields. After cutting came threshing. Animals walked slowly over harvested stalks spread across hard ground. Their careful steps loosened grain from straw. Workers used wooden forks to lift the mixture into the afternoon breeze. The lighter chaff drifted away. The heavier grains fell back toward the earth. Again and again. Lift. Toss. Wait. Watch. Repeat. The rhythm became almost peaceful. Dust floated through warm sunlight. Golden grains gathered into neat piles. Children sometimes chased loose pieces of straw blowing across the yard before returning to help their parents. Every grain mattered. Each one represented food. Each one represented another season survived. The farmer's wife inspected the finished grain with experienced eyes. She removed tiny stones, broken stems, anything that did not belong. Her fingers moved quickly despite long hours of work. She had done this many times before. Perhaps hundreds. Perhaps thousands. Nearby, bread baked inside simple clay ovens. Warm scents drifted across the workyard. Fresh loaves rested on woven baskets while family members paused to eat together. Their meal remained simple. Bread. Onions. A little fish from the river. Perhaps dates if the season had been kind. Water cooled slightly beneath damp cloth covering clay jars. No feast. No celebration. Only another ordinary evening shared beneath a slowly darkening sky. When enough grain had been cleaned, someone brought forward empty sacks. They had been folded carefully and stored since the previous harvest. The linen felt rough beneath hard-working hands. Each sack carried small signs of age. Old repairs. Faded stitching. Soft places where years of carrying had worn the cloth. One by one they were filled. Wooden scoops transferred barley into waiting sacks. Each scoop made a quiet rustling sound. Grain settled naturally under its own weight. The sack slowly grew larger, heavier, rounder. When enough barley had been added, the top was gathered together and tied securely with twisted rope. One finished sack stood upright. Then another. Then several more. Among them rested the very sack whose journey we now follow. Nothing marked it as different. No special symbol. No richer cloth. No brighter color. It simply waited alongside the others. Morning sunlight warmed its surface. Night dew cooled it again. Days passed while plans were quietly made. Not every sack would remain with the farmer's family. Some would feed them throughout the coming months. Some would become seed for another growing season. Some would be offered as payment. Some would travel toward distant towns. The grain sack belonged to that final group. Its journey would begin before sunrise. The evening before departure felt peaceful. The family finished supper together. Children became sleepy after another busy day. Their laughter gradually disappeared as darkness spread across the village. The farmer checked the ropes securing each sack one final time. He pressed gently against the cloth. Satisfied. Everything seemed ready. His donkey rested nearby. The patient animal had carried heavy loads for many years. It understood morning routines almost as well as its owner. Fresh straw covered the stable floor. The donkey lowered its head and quietly chewed while insects hummed softly outside. Inside the house, everyone settled onto woven reed mats. A faint breeze entered through the doorway. Oil lamps flickered lower. The village slowly surrendered itself to sleep. Only distant sounds remained. Water touching reeds. A night bird calling. Someone quietly closing a wooden gate. Hours passed. Stars crossed the sky. Eventually the eastern horizon began changing almost too slowly to notice. Dark blue softened toward pale gray. The first bird welcomed morning. Another answered. Then several more. The farmer opened his eyes before sunrise. There was no need for anyone to wake him. Years of routine had taught his body exactly when another workday should begin. He sat quietly for a few moments. The house remained peaceful. His family still slept. Outside, cool morning air entered through the doorway carrying the scent of damp earth. He stepped carefully across the floor. His linen clothing felt cool against his skin. Simple leather sandals waited where he had left them the evening before. He slipped them on without making unnecessary noise. Soon he stood outside beneath a sky painted with the first colors of dawn. The village stretched awake slowly. Smoke began rising from a few cooking fires. Someone swept dust from a doorway using bundled reeds. A woman carried empty clay jars toward the river. Another family prepared their donkey for travel. Nothing hurried. Everything unfolded with familiar calm. The farmer greeted a neighbor with a quiet nod. Neither spoke much. There would be plenty of work before the day ended. The grain sacks waited exactly where they had been left. He untied the stable gate. The donkey stepped forward willingly. Patient eyes blinked against growing sunlight. The animal already understood what the morning required. Carefully, the farmer lifted the first grain sack. Its weight settled heavily across his shoulder. Strong muscles strained for only a moment before finding balance. He crossed the short distance toward the waiting donkey. Slowly he lowered the sack onto one side of a wooden carrying frame. Then another sack balanced the opposite side. The load rested evenly, securely. Our single grain sack now hung quietly beside another filled with the same golden harvest. Its long journey had finally begun. The donkey shifted its weight. The ropes tightened gently. Nothing spilled. The farmer checked each knot again. A careful habit. One loose rope could waste weeks of precious labor. Satisfied once more, he reached for the lead rope. Behind him, his wife stepped outside carrying warm bread wrapped inside linen cloth. She handed him the simple meal with gentle familiarity. No long farewell was needed. This journey was ordinary. He might return before sunset. Or perhaps after another day. Such trips happened many times each year. She smiled softly. He nodded. The donkey took its first slow step. Then another. The village gradually disappeared behind them as dusty roads stretched toward the awakening countryside. Morning sunlight spread across fields where countless farmers had already begun another day's labor. Mist lingered above irrigation canals. Birds searched freshly turned soil. The Nile flowed quietly beyond rows of green crops, carrying water toward places both near and distant. The grain sack swayed gently with each steady step of the donkey. Its journey had only just begun. Far ahead waited villages it had never seen. Boats rocking quietly beside wooden docks. Busy storehouses filled with careful scribes. Market squares scented with bread and spices. Bakeries where flour became warm loaves. Homes where hungry families gathered together at day's end. Yet none of those places seemed close this peaceful morning. For now there was only the road. The steady rhythm of careful footsteps. The soft creak of wooden frames. The quiet breathing of a patient donkey beneath the slowly rising Egyptian sun. And together they continued onward, one slow step after another, as another calm day unfolded beside the timeless waters of the Nile. The road welcomed the morning in its own quiet way. It did not speak, yet it remembered every traveler who had passed across its dusty surface. Sandals had worn smooth places into the earth. Donkey hooves had left countless gentle marks. Wooden sledges had carved faint lines that faded beneath each new breeze. The road stretched onward without hurry, winding between fields, irrigation channels, clusters of palms, and the occasional stand of reeds where birds rested before the day grew warm. The farmer walked with an easy rhythm. His feet knew this path almost as well as they knew the floor of his own home. There was no need to count the distance. His body understood it through habit. One step followed another, just as it had on many mornings before this one. Beside him, the donkey carried its load patiently. The two grain sacks rested evenly across the wooden frame. With each careful step, they moved only a little. Inside, thousands of barley grains settled softly against one another. If anyone had placed an ear against the cloth, they might have heard the faintest whisper as the grains shifted together, a quiet sound almost lost beneath the gentle breeze. The sun continued its slow climb. Its light spread across the valley in soft gold before growing brighter. Long shadows stretched behind the farmer and his donkey. Dew still clung to patches of grass near the irrigation canals. Soon the warmth would dry every shining drop. Along the edges of the fields, other workers had already begun their morning. One elderly man repaired a small earthen wall that guided water into his crops. Kneeling carefully, he packed damp mud into a narrow crack with practiced hands. He worked slowly, stopping now and then to examine his work before adding another handful. Nearby, two brothers lifted water using a shad of the long wooden pole balanced with a heavy counterweight. One lowered the bucket into the canal. The other guided the pole as the water rose. Together they poured the precious water into a narrow channel that carried it gently toward thirsty plants. Again they repeated the movement. Lower. Lift. Pour. Rest. Lower again. The rhythm seemed almost musical in its steadiness. The farmer raised a hand in greeting as he passed. The brothers smiled. No one stopped walking. Morning hours were valuable, especially before the heat became heavy. A flock of white birds lifted suddenly from the edge of the river. Their wings caught the sunlight for only a moment before they settled farther downstream. The Nile itself flowed with quiet confidence, never rushing, never appearing still. Small ripples touched the muddy banks where reeds bent gently with the current. Fishing boats rested close to shore. Some had already returned from the early hours before sunrise. Others prepared to leave. One fisherman stood inside his narrow boat repairing a section of woven net. His fingers worked carefully, tying each knot with patient precision. The net had been mended many times before. A tier was simply another ordinary part of life beside the river. His son sat near the bow, watching carefully. The boy was still too young to throw the heavy nets by himself, but he watched every movement. Someday his own hands would make these same careful knots without needing to think about them. The farmer and donkey continued onward. The grain sack listened only to the gentle sounds around it. Birdsong. Flowing water. Sandals brushing dust. The soft breathing of the donkey. The world remained peaceful. As the morning grew brighter, more travelers appeared along the road. A woman balanced a clay jar upon her head while another rested comfortably against her hip. She walked with remarkable steadiness, hardly touching the jars with her hands. Years of practice allowed her body to find its own balance. Behind her walked two young girls carrying smaller jars. They laughed quietly together about something only they understood. Their voices floated briefly across the road before disappearing behind another stand of palms. Farther ahead came an elderly merchant leading 3 donkeys. Unlike the farmer's simple load, these animals carried woven baskets filled with dried dates, onions, bundles of flax, and folded linen cloth. Small bells hung loosely from their harnesses. They did not ring loudly. Instead, they made soft, pleasant sounds each time the animals moved. The 2 men greeted each other warmly. "Peace to your morning." "And to yours." They exchanged only a few words. The merchant asked whether the harvest had been kind. The farmer nodded. The river was generous. The merchant smiled. "Then perhaps the bakeries will smell even sweeter this month." Both men seemed pleased by that simple thought. Soon they continued in opposite directions. The road belonged to everyone. No traveler remained together for very long. By now the warmth of the sun could be felt upon every shoulder. The coolness of dawn slowly faded. Dust became lighter beneath each step. A small breeze drifted across the valley carrying the scent of damp earth mixed with growing grain. Somewhere nearby, fresh bread baked inside a clay oven. The smell lingered in the air. The farmer smiled without thinking. His own breakfast still rested inside the linen cloth his wife had packed. He decided not to eat yet. There would be shade ahead. There was always a favorite resting place not far from the large sycamore tree beside the river. He had stopped there many times before. There was no reason to hurry. The donkey certainly had no desire to rush. Its ears turned gently whenever birds called from nearby trees. Every now and then it lowered its head to sniff patches of grass growing beside the road, though it continued walking whenever the lead rope became gently tight. The grain sacks remained secure. The ropes held firm. The linen cloth rubbed softly against the wooden frame. Each stitch, made many years ago by careful hands, quietly continued doing its work. As the road curved closer to the Nile, the air became slightly cooler. The river breeze carried a welcome freshness. Palm trees lined the bank, their leaves moving with slow grace high above the water. Fallen dates rested beneath several trees, where goats searched carefully for forgotten fruit. A young shepherd watched over them. He leaned upon a wooden staff while his flock wandered peacefully through sparse patches of grass. Some goats climbed low rocks. Others stretched toward leaves growing just beyond comfortable reach. The shepherd seemed in no hurry to guide them. He knew they would stay close enough. His eyes drifted toward the passing farmer. Again came a quiet nod. Again came a gentle smile. Such small greetings were enough. Words were precious beneath the growing heat. The road soon reached the broad shade of the sycamore. Its branches spread wide above the earth, offering cool relief that travelers appreciated with quiet gratitude. The farmer slowed. The donkey seemed almost to recognize the place. Without being asked, it stopped beneath the deepest shade. The man loosened the lead rope. He carefully checked the grain sacks once again. Everything remained secure. The donkey lowered its head and began chewing dry grass growing near the roots of the great tree. The farmer sat upon a smooth stone polished by countless travelers before him. From his linen bundle he removed a round loaf of barley bread. Its crust had become slightly firm during the journey, but inside it remained soft. He broke off a piece. Then another. A few bites became his breakfast. He also shared a portion with the donkey. The animal accepted it happily. Nearby stood another traveler already resting. He was a potter returning from a village farther north. His donkey carried stacks of carefully wrapped clay bowls cushioned with bundles of straw. The potter watched the river quietly for a long moment before speaking. "It is peaceful this morning." The farmer nodded. "It is." Neither man felt the need to say more. Silence was not uncomfortable. The breeze filled the quiet spaces between them. Water touched the shore with gentle sounds. A kingfisher flashed bright blue across the river before disappearing into reeds. Somewhere among the palms, doves cooed softly. The grain sack rested patiently beside the donkey. For the first time since leaving the village, it was completely still. Dust settled lightly upon its rough linen surface. Tiny insects crawled across the woven fibers before continuing their own journeys. The sack asked for nothing. It simply waited. After a little while, the farmer stood again. He stretched his back slowly. Long walks became easier when interrupted by small moments of rest. He folded the remaining bread inside the cloth. The donkey lifted its head as if already expecting the journey to continue. The lead rope tightened gently once more. Together they stepped back onto the road. The landscape slowly began to change. Fields became larger. The irrigation canals widened. More workers appeared. Some harvested vegetables. Others repaired fences made from woven reeds. Children chased ducks away from freshly planted crops while laughing softly whenever the birds stubbornly returned. The farther they walked, the more signs appeared that they were approaching a larger settlement. More boats moved upon the river. Smoke rose from many cooking fires. The sound of distant voices drifted across open fields. A pair of oxen pulled a heavy wooden plow through dark soil while their owner guided them with calm commands. Not far away, several women sat together beneath a shaded shelter spinning flax into fine thread. Their fingers moved almost without thought. Twist. Pull. Wrap. Repeat. Conversation flowed quietly between them, rising and falling as naturally as the breeze. Children played nearby using little toys carved from scraps of wood. An older grandmother watched them while mending a torn basket. Every person seemed busy. Not hurried. Simply busy. The rhythm of ordinary life continued in every direction. The grain sack was only one small part of this larger rhythm. Without grain, the baker could not bake. Without bread, workers could not labor through the heat. Without workers, canals would remain broken. Fields would dry. Boats would carry less cargo. Markets would become quieter. A single sack of barley seemed ordinary. Yet many ordinary things quietly held the world together. The farmer likely thought very little about this. His thoughts remained simple. He wondered whether prices would be fair today. He hoped the journey home would finish before sunset. He considered whether another irrigation wall would need repairing tomorrow. He remembered that his youngest child had been asking for a small carved toy. Perhaps if enough grain was sold, he might bring one home. The thought made him smile. Nothing grand. Nothing expensive. Just a little wooden bird or animal carved by a village craftsman. Such small gifts often brought the greatest happiness. The road widened further. Soon they could see the first outer storehouses of the riverside town standing beyond rows of date palms. Large mud brick buildings rose above the surrounding homes. Their walls were thick and plain, built to protect valuable food from weather, insects, and thieves. Workers moved steadily between the buildings carrying baskets, jars, and bundled goods. Donkeys waited beneath shaded shelters. Boats unloaded cargo along simple wooden docks. The quiet grain sack had reached the next step of its long journey. Without fanfare, without ceremony, and without anyone paying special attention to it, it swayed gently as the farmer led the patient donkey toward the busy storehouses, where careful hands, sharp eyes, and rows of waiting scribes would soon decide where this humble harvest would travel next. The town awakened fully long before the middle of the day. From a distance, it had seemed calm and almost silent, but as the farmer and his donkey walked closer, the quiet sounds of ordinary work slowly gathered together. None of them were loud. They blended into a steady rhythm that belonged only to places where many people lived and labored side by side. Sandals brushed over packed earth. Donkeys breathed through tired noses after long walks. Clay jars touched one another with soft, hollow sounds. Wooden doors opened. Bundles of reeds were set gently onto the ground. Someone swept dust away from a doorway with a reed broom, making small circles that disappeared almost as quickly as they were made. The grain sack moved through all of this without knowing where it would finally rest. Its rough linen cloth had collected another thin layer of dust during the journey. The knots at its opening remained tight. The barley inside rested quietly, packed close together after many hours of gentle swaying. The road led toward a broad open space beside the river. Here, boats came and went throughout the day. Some were no longer than a family home, built to carry only a few baskets of vegetables or jars of beer. Others stretched much farther along the water, their wide decks waiting for larger cargoes. Their hulls rested low in the Nile, ready to receive grain, pottery, timber, stone, or woven cloth. The river itself seemed unconcerned by the busy shoreline. It continued flowing at the same patient pace. Tiny ripples spread away from the bows of passing boats. Sunlight danced upon the moving surface, breaking into countless small flashes before joining together again. A pair of fishermen guided their narrow craft toward the bank. Their nets looked heavy. Perhaps they had enjoyed a fortunate morning. One man lifted the edge of the net while the other steadied the boat with a long wooden pole. They spoke quietly to one another, their conversation almost hidden beneath the gentle splash of water against the hull. The farmer paused for only a moment to allow them to pass. There was no need to hurry. The grain would still be waiting. The storehouses had stood there for many years. They would stand there tomorrow as well. Patience was as useful as strength in places like this. Ahead, the walls of the nearest storehouse rose from the earth like a great block of warm brown clay. The building had few windows. The small openings near the roof allowed air to move through the interior while keeping out much of the bright sun. Thick mud brick walls protected the grain from sudden rain, wandering animals, and the fierce afternoon heat. Outside stood several workers. Some carried empty baskets. Others rolled woven mats that had been drying in the sunlight. One elderly man carefully repaired a wooden doorway whose lower edge had become worn smooth after years of use. He worked slowly, shaving tiny curls of wood with a bronze blade. Nearby, a young apprentice gathered the shavings into a basket. Neither seemed rushed. The work would take as long as it needed. The farmer guided his donkey into a waiting line. He was not the first to arrive. Several other farmers had reached the town before sunrise. Their donkeys stood patiently beneath simple shade shelters made from reeds tied across wooden poles. Some animals closed their eyes while waiting. Others flicked their ears whenever flies wandered too close. The smell of grain filled the air. Not the warm smell of fresh bread. Not yet. This was the clean, dry scent of harvest itself. It mixed with the earthy smell of mud bricks, sun-warmed rope, woven baskets, and the river breeze drifting across the docks. A boy walked through the waiting line carrying a clay jar filled with water. He offered drinks to travelers. The water was cool enough to refresh tired mouths after the long walk. The farmer accepted gratefully. He thanked the boy with a gentle smile before drinking slowly. Not far away, another worker carried handfuls of fresh reeds to spread beneath stacked baskets. The reeds helped keep the baskets dry. Little details like these mattered. A careless storehouse could lose valuable grain to dampness or insects. Every task had its purpose. Even the smallest. At the entrance stood two scribes. They were easy to recognize. Their linen clothing appeared especially clean despite the dusty surroundings. One carried a wooden writing palette with small cakes of black and red pigment. Several reed pens rested neatly inside a narrow groove. The other held a rolled sheet of papyrus beneath one arm. Neither man looked hurried. Their work demanded careful attention. Every sack entering the storehouse would be counted. Its owner would be recorded. Its destination noted. Its quantity measured. Mistakes could travel farther than the grain itself. One scribe looked up as the farmer approached. He smiled politely. "Good morning. And to you." "The harvest." "Barley." "From which village?" The farmer answered. The scribe dipped the tip of his reed pen into dark ink. His hand moved smoothly across the papyrus. Tiny signs appeared one after another with graceful precision. Years of practice allowed him to write almost without hesitation. His fingers remained steady. His breathing slow. Occasionally he paused only long enough to glance toward the grain sacks before continuing. The second scribe prepared a measuring record. Nearby stood several large wooden containers used for checking the amount of grain delivered. The process required patience. No one complained. Everyone understood that careful counting protected both farmer and storehouse alike. The farmer untied the ropes securing the first grain sack. He bent his knees before lifting. The weight settled heavily against his shoulder once again. His muscles already knew exactly how to carry such a burden. Slowly he crossed the cool shadow cast by the doorway. For the first time since leaving the village, the grain sack entered the great storehouse. Inside, the air felt different. The thick walls softened the heat of the day. The light became gentle. Thin beams of sunshine entered through small openings near the roof, catching tiny particles of dust that floated peacefully through the still air. Rows upon rows of grain sacks stood quietly against the walls. Some had arrived only that morning. Others had rested there for several days. Each looked much like the next. Each held the careful work of farming families from villages scattered all along the Nile. The room felt almost peaceful despite being filled with food enough to feed hundreds of people. There was no shouting. Only soft footsteps. The rustle of linen. The scrape of baskets across the floor. A distant cough. The quiet scratching of reed pens on papyrus outside the doorway. The farmer lowered the sack gently beside a measuring container. Another worker stepped forward. He untied the knot at the top. Warm, golden barley appeared inside. The grains caught the thin shafts of sunlight like tiny pieces of polished stone. The measuring began. A broad wooden scoop disappeared into the sack. It emerged full. The barley poured into the measuring container with a soft rushing sound, almost like dry rain. Thousands of tiny grains slid together. The sound was gentle, steady, comforting. Again the scoop dipped. Again it rose. Again the barley flowed. Each measure was counted aloud in calm voices. One. Then another. Then another still. Outside, the scribe listened carefully. Each number became another line upon the papyrus. Nothing was rushed. Accuracy mattered more than speed. Once the measuring was complete, the grain was poured back into the sack. Not a single handful was wasted. The knot was tied once more. A small clay seal was pressed against fresh cord to mark that the contents had been officially measured. The farmer watched carefully. Satisfied, he nodded. Everything had been done properly. The grain sack now belonged to the next stage of its journey. It would not return home with the farmer. Instead, it joined dozens of others waiting inside the cool storehouse. The farmer stepped outside. His shoulders felt noticeably lighter. He rolled them slowly, easing muscles that had carried the heavy load since dawn. His donkey waited quietly beneath the shade. Only one sack remained upon its back. Soon that one would be measured as well. Life inside the storehouse continued with the same gentle rhythm. Workers stacked sacks carefully, never placing them directly against the walls where dampness might gather after rare rains. Small spaces remained between each row so inspectors could walk through and check for insects or damaged cloth. Cats wandered silently through the building. They had an important task. Where grain was stored, mice sometimes arrived. The cats knew their work without needing instruction. One gray cat stretched lazily atop a pile of folded mats before disappearing between stacked sacks. No one paid it much attention. It had likely lived there for years. In one quiet corner, an older worker repaired torn grain sacks. He sat upon a low wooden stool. Needle in hand. Strong linen thread beside him. His fingers moved with calm confidence. Push the needle through. Pull the thread. Tighten the stitch. Begin again. The repaired cloth looked almost as strong as when it had first been woven. He did not waste words. He did not waste thread. Each sack deserved another season of service if careful hands could provide it. Our grain sack rested only a short distance away. For the first time since harvest, it was completely still. No footsteps. No swaying. No dusty road beneath it. Only the quiet company of hundreds of other sacks, each carrying its own season's work from another family somewhere along the river. Outside, the day slowly moved toward afternoon. The sunlight became brighter. The stone paths warmed beneath passing sandals. The smell of baking bread drifted from nearby ovens as millers, bakers, and merchants quietly prepared for the next part of the grain's long journey. But for now, the humble sack rested in the cool shadows of the storehouse, surrounded by careful order, patient workers, and the peaceful certainty that every grain inside would, in time, find its way into the hands of someone who depended upon it. The afternoon settled gently over the riverside town. Outside the storehouse, the sunlight had become bright and steady. The shadows beneath the walls grew shorter as the sun climbed toward its highest place in the sky. Heat slowly gathered over the packed earth, softening distant shapes until they seemed to shimmer above the road. Inside, however, the air remained pleasantly cool. The thick mud brick walls did their quiet work, just as they had for many years. They held back much of the afternoon warmth, allowing the grain to rest in a place where it would stay dry and safe. Only thin ribbons of sunlight entered through the high openings beneath the roof. Dust floated through those beams without haste, turning slowly in the still air before disappearing into shadow again. The grain sack stood where it had been placed after the measuring was finished. Its linen sides bulged gently beneath the weight of the barley. A small clay seal rested against the cord tied around its mouth. The seal carried the simple mark of the storehouse, pressed into the damp clay while it was still soft. Now it had hardened beneath the dry Egyptian air. Nearby rested many other sacks. Some were smaller. Some were larger. Some held barley like this one. Others contained emmer wheat, the grain used for much of the bread baked throughout the Nile Valley. A few carried lentils or dried beans gathered from fields farther away. Each sack had arrived by a different road. Each had been filled by different hands. Some came from villages close enough that a farmer could return home before sunset. Others had traveled for several days, stopping each night beside the river or beneath small shelters along the road. Although they now stood together inside the same building, every sack carried a quiet memory of another field, another family, another harvest. A storehouse worker walked slowly down the narrow path between the rows. His job was simple. Every afternoon he inspected the grain. He looked for torn cloth, loose cords, signs of dampness, tiny holes that might allow insects to enter. His eyes missed very little. Years of experience had taught him what to notice. He paused beside one sack whose rope had become slightly loose. Without calling anyone, he untied the knot, pulled the cord tighter, and secured it once more. The task took less than a minute. Then he continued walking. Nothing dramatic had happened. Nothing unusual. It was simply another small piece of ordinary work. The grain sack waited quietly as the man approached. He rested one hand against the rough linen. The cloth felt dry, firm. The seal remained unbroken. Satisfied, he moved on. The inspection continued. Near the far wall, another worker swept the floor with a broad reed broom. He moved slowly so that dust would not rise into thick clouds. Grain that had escaped during measuring was gathered carefully. Nothing useful was wasted. Loose barley was placed into a small basket. Later it would be added to other gathered grain. Even a handful mattered. Across the room sat an elderly woman weaving new grain sacks. Her fingers worked with calm confidence. Long strips of linen lay across her lap. She threaded them together with practiced movements that no longer required thought. Over. Under. Pull gently. Straighten the edge. Repeat. Her hands had repeated these motions for so many years that they seemed to know the work by themselves. Occasionally she paused. Not because she was tired. Only to stretch her fingers before beginning again. The cloth slowly grew beneath her careful hands. One day it too would carry grain across the valley. Perhaps it would travel farther than any sack before it. Perhaps it would remain close to home. There was no way to know. The afternoon breeze found its way through the high openings near the roof. It carried with it the distant smells of the town. Fresh bread. Warm straw. River water. Clay drying beneath the sun. Somewhere nearby someone was roasting onions. The sweet, familiar scent drifted softly through the building before fading away again. Outside, life continued at its gentle pace. A line of donkeys entered the town from the southern road. Their loads were different from those that had arrived earlier. These animals carried bundles of papyrus reeds harvested along the riverbanks. The reeds would become baskets, writing material, rope, mats, and many other useful things. Behind them walked several young men whose shoulders glistened with sweat beneath the afternoon sun. Their linen clothing clung lightly to their backs. Even so, their pace remained steady. They spoke little. The day was warm enough that conversation seemed unnecessary. Near the docks, a carpenter sat beneath a woven shade. A low table stood before him. Across it rested wooden pegs, small chisels, smooth stones used for polishing, and several pieces of acacia wood. One by one he shaped replacement handles for farming tools. Each handle felt smooth beneath his fingers. He lifted every finished piece to examine it in the sunlight before placing it beside the others. There was satisfaction in making something useful. Even if no one ever learned his name. Not far away, a baker opened the mouth of his clay oven. The heat rolled outward in gentle waves. Inside, round loaves rested against the hot inner walls. Their crusts slowly turned golden. The smell drifted through nearby streets, reaching travelers, workers, children, and anyone passing close enough. Several boys paused outside the bakery. Their eyes followed each fresh loaf as it emerged. The baker smiled. He had seen that look many times before. Soon enough, each loaf would find its place upon someone's table. Some would feed builders repairing canal walls. Some would become meals for fishermen returning before sunset. Others would be carried home beneath folded linen cloth to waiting families. Much of that bread would begin with grain resting quietly inside buildings like this one. Back inside the storehouse, the scribes continued their work. The morning's deliveries filled several sheets of papyrus. Each line represented careful labor stretching far beyond the walls of the town. One scribe gently rubbed his wrist before continuing to write. His fingers had held the reed pen since sunrise. Even careful work could become tiring. He dipped the pen once more into black ink. Tiny symbols appeared across the papyrus in neat rows. Each mark carried meaning. Each mark helped ensure that grain reached the places where it was needed. Beside him stood a younger apprentice. He watched every movement. Sometimes he prepared fresh ink. Sometimes he dried completed pages. Occasionally he asked quiet questions. The older scribe answered patiently. Years from now, the apprentice's own handwriting would become just as smooth. Learning happened slowly. One careful day after another. As the afternoon stretched onward, the first boatmasters entered the storehouse courtyard. They had come to collect grain that would travel north along the Nile. Unlike roads, the river offered long, gentle journeys. The current itself helped carry boats toward the great delta. When the wind was favorable, square linen sails caught the breeze and pushed the vessels onward with little effort. The boatmasters spoke quietly with the storehouse officials. They examined clay seals, compared written records, discussed how many sacks could safely fit aboard each boat. No voices became loud. Everyone understood the importance of calm, careful planning. A boat overloaded with grain would sit too low in the water. A poorly balanced cargo might shift during the journey. Patience prevented many problems. Late in the afternoon, several workers entered the cool storage room carrying broad wooden carrying poles. Their footsteps echoed softly across the packed earth floor. One by one they stopped beside selected grain sacks. Not every sack would leave today. Many would remain for days. Some perhaps for weeks. Our grain sack still rested quietly where it had been placed. One worker glanced toward its clay seal. He checked a small list carried by the overseer. Then he nodded. "Tomorrow morning," he said softly. Only 2 words. The overseer marked the record with a small stroke of his reed pen. Tomorrow morning. The grain sack's journey would continue once more. For now, there was nothing to do except wait. The workers moved on to other rows. Several sacks were lifted onto wooden poles by teams of 2 men. Together they raised the heavy loads onto their shoulders. Their steps matched naturally. Left. Right. Left. Right. The sacks swayed gently between them as they disappeared toward the doorway leading to the docks. Soon those sacks would rest aboard waiting river boats. The storehouse grew quieter again. Fewer voices echoed through its cool interior. Outside, the bright afternoon slowly softened. The harsh light became warmer. Long shadows began stretching across the courtyard once more. Birds returned to the reeds along the riverbank. The breeze carried a little more coolness than it had only an hour before. Even the donkeys seemed grateful. Some stood quietly chewing bundles of straw provided by the stable keeper. Others drank from shallow stone troughs filled with river water. Their ears twitched lazily whenever flies wandered too close. Children passed through the streets carrying small bundles of firewood gathered earlier in the day. Women returned from the river with fresh water balanced inside clay jars. Old men sat beneath the shade of sycamore trees, speaking softly about crops, weather, and the height of the river. Nothing hurried. The day unfolded exactly as so many days before it had unfolded. The grain sack rested in the peaceful stillness of the storehouse. Its long journey was only beginning. Soon it would leave the familiar safety of dry land and trust itself to the slow current of the Nile, where patient boats, gentle winds, quiet boatmen, and endless stretches of calm water would carry it farther from the field where a single farmer had once scattered tiny seeds into soft, dark earth. Evening arrived so quietly that few people noticed the exact moment when afternoon became night. The bright white light of the Egyptian sun slowly softened into warm shades of gold. The walls of the storehouses glowed gently before their color faded into deep browns and soft grays. Along the riverbank, the water reflected the changing sky until both seemed almost the same color. Inside the storehouse, the grain sack remained exactly where it had rested throughout the afternoon. Nothing disturbed it. The clay seal remained firm. The linen cord stayed tightly tied. The barley inside settled a little more under its own weight, each tiny grain finding the smallest empty space beside another. If someone had watched closely, they might have noticed the cloth relax ever so slightly as the grain became more compact. No one noticed. There were many other things to do before darkness fully arrived. The workers slowly finished their daily tasks. One by one they carried away empty measuring baskets. The broad wooden scoops were stacked neatly against a wall. Bundles of spare rope were hung from wooden pegs where they would remain dry until morning. The reed brooms leaned together beside the doorway. Every tool returned to its familiar place. The routines never changed very much. That was one reason the storehouse worked so well. Everyone knew where things belonged. Everyone understood the order of each task. The oldest workers no longer needed instructions. Their hands simply followed habits formed over many years. A young apprentice walked carefully between the rows of grain sacks carrying a small oil lamp. The flame was no larger than the tip of his thumb. Still, it filled the room with gentle light. He stopped beside each row. His eyes searched quietly. No broken seals. No loose cords. No torn cloth. No signs that mice had found their way inside. Everything appeared exactly as it should. When he reached the end of the final row, he gave a small nod to the overseer. All is well. The overseer smiled. Good. No further words were needed. Outside, the sounds of the town began changing. The busy footsteps of merchants slowly disappeared. Donkeys carrying heavy loads reached their final destinations for the day. Wooden gates closed one after another. Children who had spent the afternoon running through dusty streets now followed their parents home. The smell of evening meals drifted across the town. Bread baked throughout the afternoon now rested inside woven baskets. Clay pots simmered slowly over cooking fires. Onions softened inside warm stews. Lentils cooked with herbs gathered from small household gardens. Fish caught before sunrise roasted above glowing coals. The scent floated gently through narrow streets before reaching the river. Boatmen tied their vessels securely to wooden posts driven deep into the muddy bank. The day's travel had ended. Tomorrow would bring another journey. But not tonight. Tonight belonged to rest. One boatman remained aboard his vessel a little longer than the others. His boat would carry grain north when morning came. He wanted everything ready before sleeping. The boat itself was broad and strong. Built from carefully joined wooden planks, it had already traveled the Nile many times. Its deck showed smooth places where countless feet had walked. The mast stood quietly against the evening sky. The large square sail had been folded neatly and tied with rope until sunrise. The boatman checked each knot with calm attention. He examined the steering oars. He inspected the ropes holding the mast. He looked inside the storage space where tomorrow's cargo would rest. Everything appeared ready. Satisfied, he stepped back onto the dock. Nearby sat another older boatman repairing a worn rope. The fibers had become rough after many seasons beneath the sun and river water. Patiently he untwisted damaged strands. Carefully he wove fresh fibers into the old rope. His fingers moved with remarkable confidence. The work was slow, steady, almost peaceful to watch. Not far away, several young workers gathered around a small cooking fire. Their meal was simple. Fresh bread, a handful of dates, a clay bowl filled with beans cooked until soft. One shared a piece of onion with another. Someone poured beer into simple pottery cups. The conversation rose and fell quietly. No one hurried to finish eating. The long day had earned them this peaceful hour. Laughter appeared now and then. Never loud. Only gentle. Like ripples spreading across calm water. As darkness slowly covered the town, stars appeared one by one above the Nile. The sky in ancient Egypt often seemed endless. Without bright lamps or tall buildings, every star shone clearly. Many travelers learned their paths by watching those distant lights. Boatmen especially knew them well. Some stars helped guide northward journeys. Others marked the changing seasons. Each night they crossed the sky with quiet certainty. The river reflected them softly. Sometimes it became difficult to tell where the water ended and the heavens began. Inside the storehouse, the air grew even cooler. The thick walls slowly released the warmth gathered during the day. The grain sack rested among hundreds of others in complete stillness. Only tiny sounds disturbed the silence. A reed mat settled slightly against the floor. A distant mouse paused, listening for one of the storehouse cats before disappearing into another shadow. A sleeping pigeon shifted somewhere high among the roof beams. The small oil lamp near the entrance flickered gently whenever the night breeze slipped through the upper openings. The elderly woman who had woven grain sacks all afternoon had already returned home. Her small house stood only a short walk from the storehouse. Its walls were built from the same sun-dried bricks found throughout the town. The roof was flat. A simple ladder leaned against one wall. After preparing her evening meal, she carried a woven mat onto the roof where cooler air made sleeping more comfortable. She looked toward the river. Boats rested quietly beneath the stars. She had spent much of her life making grain sacks. She wondered, not for the first time, where each one eventually traveled. Some likely remained nearby. Others perhaps reached towns she had never visited. Still others might continue all the way toward the broad northern marshes where the Nile spread into many branches before meeting the Great Sea. She smiled at the thought. Her work quietly traveled farther than she ever would. Back inside the storehouse, another quiet visitor appeared. A gray cat stepped silently between the rows of grain sacks. Its paws made almost no sound upon the packed earth floor. It paused. Its ears turned toward a faint scratching noise. Completely still, the cat waited. Nothing moved. Then, in a single smooth motion, it slipped behind a stack of baskets. Moments later, the scratching stopped. The storehouse returned to silence. The grain remained safe. The night watchman sat outside beneath a small shelter built beside the entrance. He held a wooden staff across his knees. Beside him rested another small oil lamp whose flame glowed warmly inside a clay dish. His task was simple. Remain awake. Watch. Listen. Most nights passed without incident. He welcomed that. Quiet nights were good nights. He watched the moon rise above the eastern horizon. Its pale light spread across the river. Soft reflections shimmered gently against tide boats. A cool breeze carried the scent of wet reeds. Far away, somewhere across the dark fields, a jackal called once. Then the sound disappeared into the night. The watchman adjusted his linen cloak around his shoulders. The evening had become pleasantly cool. Inside the storehouse, the grain sack remained asleep in its own quiet way. Tomorrow, before the first light touched the eastern sky, workers would return. The broad doors would open once again. Footsteps would echo softly across the floor. Names would be checked. Clay seals examined. Strong shoulders would lift heavy loads. The grain sack would leave the cool darkness of the storehouse and make its way toward the waiting river boat. It had already crossed fields where barley once swayed beneath the wind. It had rested inside a farmer's home. It had traveled dusty roads behind a patient donkey. It had stood among careful scribes and quiet workers. Soon it would begin another chapter, carried not by steady footsteps but by the timeless current of the Nile itself, a river that had gently carried food, families, stories, and ordinary lives through Egypt for longer than anyone could remember. And while the stars drifted slowly overhead, and the peaceful town settled deeper into sleep, the little grain sack waited with quiet patience for another calm morning to begin. Long before the sun returned to warm the valley, the town rested beneath a sky filled with fading stars. The air felt cool. Not cold, but pleasantly fresh after the long heat of the previous day. A gentle breeze drifted along the Nile, carrying the scent of wet reeds, damp earth, and quiet water. The river moved through the darkness with the same calm rhythm it had carried for countless generations. Inside the storehouse, everything remained still. Rows of grain sacks stood patiently in the soft darkness. Their shapes appeared only as gentle outlines beneath the faint light entering through the small openings high in the walls. The grain sack rested exactly where it had been left. Its long journey paused for only a single night. Soon it would begin again. Outside, the first sound of morning was not a human voice. It was a bird. Somewhere among the palms beside the river, one small bird welcomed the coming dawn with a short, gentle song. Another answered. Then another. Before long, the quiet music spread through the trees. The town itself remained asleep. Only the birds seemed to know that another day had quietly arrived. Far across the eastern horizon, the darkness slowly became lighter. Deep blue softened into pale gray. Then came a thin band of gentle gold where earth met sky. The Nile reflected every change. The water seemed to awaken together with the light. The night watchman stood slowly from his wooden stool. He stretched his back with careful movements. His long shift had almost ended. Nothing unusual had happened. The storehouse remained safe. The grain remained dry. The clay seals remained untouched. He was pleased. A peaceful night was always welcome. Soon another man approached carrying a fresh oil lamp whose flame burned steadily despite the morning breeze. The two men greeted each other with quiet smiles. No long conversation followed. The watchman simply handed over the wooden staff. Another ordinary exchange. Another ordinary morning. The broad wooden doors of the storehouse opened with a slow, familiar creak. Cool air drifted outward. The first workers entered without hurry. One carried a broom made from bundled reeds. Another brought fresh rope. A third carried a small clay jar filled with clean water for washing measuring tools before the day's work began. Inside, the soft sounds of another workday slowly returned. Footsteps crossed the packed earth floor. Baskets were lifted from neat stacks. Wooden scoops were placed beside the measuring containers. Someone rolled open woven mats that had protected several work tables overnight. Every movement felt familiar. No one needed instructions. Routine guided everyone. The grain sack watched nothing, of course. Yet if it could have understood the quiet rhythm surrounding it, it would have recognized that every person inside the building trusted these simple habits. The same work. The same order. The same careful attention. That steadiness allowed thousands of families throughout Egypt to depend upon food reaching the right places at the right time. Soon the overseer entered. He carried several folded sheets of papyrus beneath one arm. Behind him walked the senior scribe. His reed pens rested neatly inside a polished wooden case. Fresh cakes of black ink had already been prepared. He sat upon a low stool near the doorway where the morning light was strongest. Carefully he unrolled yesterday's records. His fingers smoothed the papyrus gently. The pages curled only slightly after spending the night rolled together. One by one he reviewed the written lines. Each name. Each village. Each quantity. Nothing had been forgotten. He dipped his reed pen into ink. A few fresh notes were added. Then he nodded toward the overseer. Everything was ready. Outside, the dock slowly became busy again. Boatmen untied thick ropes from wooden posts. The folded sails remained lowered for now. The morning air was calm. Without enough wind, the boats would rely first upon poles and oars until a stronger breeze arrived. Several young laborers swept yesterday's dust from the decks. Another checked bundles of spare rope. One elderly sailor carefully rubbed oil into a wooden steering oar. The smooth wood had grown dry beneath many days of sun. A little care now would help it last another season. The boat that would carry the grain waited quietly beside the dock. Its broad deck looked empty. Not for long. A wooden gangplank connected the vessel to the shore. Soon heavy footsteps would cross it again and again. The river itself remained patient. It had watched countless harvests arrive. It had carried grain through years of rich floods and through years when the water rose only modestly. The river never hurried. Neither did those who truly understood it. Back inside the storehouse, several workers entered carrying long wooden poles. Each pole rested comfortably across the shoulders of two men. The poles would help them lift heavy grain sacks together. Working in pairs prevented injury. Heavy loads became lighter when shared. The overseer unfolded one sheet of papyrus. He scanned the list. Then quietly spoke several names. The selected workers nodded. They already knew what would happen next. One by one they walked between the rows of grain sacks. The overseer stopped beside our grain sack. He looked briefly at the clay seal. Still unbroken. He compared the mark with the written record. Satisfied, he gave another small nod. This one. The two workers bent their knees together. One stood at each end of the sack. Strong hands gripped the rough linen carefully. Not too tightly. Enough to lift without straining the cloth. Ready. Together they raised the grain sack from the floor. The barley shifted softly inside. A quiet rushing sound filled the still air. For the first time since yesterday morning, the sack moved again. It rose steadily onto the wooden carrying pole suspended between the two men. Balanced. Secure. The workers adjusted their shoulders. The weight settled evenly. Then they began walking. Their steps matched naturally. Left. Right. Left. Right. Years of carrying heavy loads had taught them how to move together almost without speaking. The path through the storehouse felt narrow but familiar. They passed stacks of empty baskets. Rows of folded reed mats. The elderly sack weaver had not yet arrived for the morning, but her stool waited where she would soon sit. The workers reached the doorway. Bright morning sunlight spilled across the threshold. For a brief moment the grain sack left the cool shadows behind. Warm light touched its linen cloth once again. Outside, the town was fully awake. The streets filled with ordinary life. Children carried small baskets for their parents. Women walked toward the market with folded linen bundles. Merchants arranged pottery upon low wooden tables. Fresh vegetables appeared beneath woven shade coverings. Fishermen returned with the morning catch. The smell of newly baked bread drifted through the air once more. The workers crossed the courtyard. Dust rose gently beneath their sandals. Nearby, another team carried 2 sacks of emmer wheat. A third group moved jars filled with dried beans. Everyone followed calm, practiced routines. There was little shouting. Only quiet instructions. A few friendly greetings. The steady sound of work. The grain sack approached the dock. The broad river stretched before it. Morning sunlight spread across the Nile in long ribbons of gold. Small ripples sparkled softly beneath the growing light. Several white birds stood near the muddy shore, watching the water with endless patience. One suddenly lifted into the air. Its wings reflected the sun before it drifted farther downstream. The waiting boat rocked almost imperceptibly against its mooring ropes. Wood creaked gently. The sound blended with the soft splash of water touching the hull. A boatman stood near the gangplank. His face had grown brown beneath many years of Egyptian sunlight. His hands were rough from rope, wood, and river water. He greeted the workers warmly. "Good morning. And to you." No more needed to be said. The loading began. The workers stepped carefully onto the wooden gangplank. The boat moved only slightly beneath their combined weight. Each man adjusted his footing without thinking. The deck smelled faintly of dry wood, rope fibers, and river water warmed by the early sun. The boatman pointed toward an open space near the center of the vessel. "Here." The workers lowered the grain sack with slow, steady movements. It touched the wooden deck softly. The weight settled. The boat hardly noticed. Many more sacks would soon join it. Still, the boatman inspected its position carefully. Cargo must remain balanced. Too much weight on one side would make the journey uncomfortable. Too much weight at either end could slow the boat against the current. He shifted the sack only a few finger widths. Satisfied, he smiled quietly. "There." The workers returned toward the dock. Again they crossed the gangplank. Again they disappeared toward the storehouse. Soon they would return carrying another heavy burden. And another after that. The grain sack rested upon the broad wooden deck. Around it the morning continued unfolding with gentle certainty. Ropes tightened. Voices remained calm. More sacks slowly filled the empty spaces nearby. Above, the folded sail waited patiently for the breeze that would carry the boat northward. Below, the timeless Nile flowed on, quiet and unhurried, ready to bear one humble sack of barley into the next peaceful chapter of its long and ordinary journey. The boat remained beside the dock as the morning slowly unfolded. There was no rush to leave. The Nile had flowed through Egypt long before this boat was built, and it would continue flowing long after the wood of its hull had returned to the earth. The river taught patience to everyone who depended upon it. The grain sack rested quietly on the deck. Its rough linen touched smooth wooden planks that had been polished by years of footsteps. Tiny scratches covered the deck, each one left by a basket, a jar, a rope, or another grain sack carried aboard during countless journeys. The wood held many quiet memories. It remembered seasons of high water. It remembered gentle winters when cool breezes filled the sails. It remembered long summers when the sun seemed to pause above the valley for endless hours. Today would become another ordinary memory. The boatman walked slowly around the growing pile of cargo. His eyes measured everything without needing a written list. He looked at the spaces between the sacks. He noticed where the weight rested. He checked that nothing leaned too heavily against the side of the boat. Years of experience had taught him that careful loading at the dock made the journey peaceful later. One poorly placed sack could slowly shift. A shifting load could move another. Soon an orderly deck might become untidy. He preferred quiet order. A younger sailor followed him. He carried several tightly rolled reed mats beneath one arm. Whenever two sacks rested against each other, he gently placed a folded mat between them. The soft reeds protected the linen from rubbing during the journey. Little acts of care like this were rarely noticed. Yet they allowed the sacks to serve through many harvests. The young sailor smiled as he worked. He had learned this habit from an older man who had once stood exactly where he stood now. Knowledge traveled quietly. One careful pair of hands teaching another. Near the bow of the boat, another sailor inspected coils of rope. He lifted each one. Turned it over. checked for worn places. If a single strand looked weak, he carefully replaced it. A rope was easy to mend while the boat rested safely at the dock. It was far less convenient in the middle of the river. Nearby, a small clay jar held fresh drinking water. Its outside surface remained damp where someone had poured river water across it earlier that morning. As the moisture slowly evaporated, the water inside became pleasantly cool. One sailor paused to drink. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand before offering the jar to another. No one drank too quickly. There would be many hours beneath the sun. Across the dock, workers continued carrying cargo. Grain sacks arrived one after another. Some were almost identical to our own. Others differed slightly. One had blue stitching where an old tier had been repaired. Another bore a faded mark made with red pigment many months earlier. Each had its own quiet history. Each had crossed fields beneath the same warm sky. Each carried food that would someday become bread upon someone's table. The grain sack now found itself surrounded by companions from many villages. Though they had never met before, they rested side by side upon the same wooden deck. As each new sack arrived, the pile grew broader. Not taller than a man. The boatman avoided stacking them too high. He wanted every load to remain stable. Air also needed to move between the sacks. Dry grain stayed healthy grain. A gentle breeze drifted across the river. The folded sail moved ever so slightly. The older boatman noticed immediately. He lifted his eyes toward the sky. High above, small white clouds drifted almost lazily. The breeze would strengthen. Perhaps not immediately, but soon. He smiled to himself. The river often offered small signs before changing. Experience taught him how to read them. The younger sailors trusted his judgment completely. By now the docks had become pleasantly busy. Another boat unloaded smooth limestone blocks brought from quarries farther south. Teams of workers rolled the heavy stones across thick wooden logs. The work demanded strength, but no one shouted. Steady voices guided each movement. Slowly, carefully, the stones reached solid ground without trouble. Farther along the shoreline, bundles of papyrus reeds were stacked beneath simple shelters. Women sorted them according to length. Some would become writing sheets. Others would become baskets. Some would be woven into sleeping mats. Even the shortest pieces would find some useful purpose. Very little was thrown away. The smell of fresh river mud mixed with the scent of sun-warmed wood. Nearby someone repaired fishing nets. Another man polished bronze tools using fine sand and smooth cloth. Children carried messages between workshops. An elderly merchant sat beneath a shade awning quietly counting folded linen cloths before placing them into neat piles. Everywhere ordinary work continued. Nothing seemed especially important by itself. Yet together these countless small tasks kept the town alive. Back aboard the grain boat, the captain finally looked toward the storehouse once again. Only a few more sacks remained waiting. He counted silently. His lips moved almost without sound. 1, 2, 3, 4. That would be enough. The boat would ride comfortably in the water. There would still be room for the crew to move freely across the deck. The final group of workers appeared carrying the last sacks. Among them walked the farmer who had brought our grain from his village. His own work was nearly finished. He paused for a moment beside the boat. His eyes found the familiar sack resting securely among the others. There was nothing special about seeing it there. Still, he looked for a heartbeat longer. Months earlier, tiny seeds had passed through his fingers into dark soil. He had watched rainless skies. He had guided water through narrow canals. He had harvested golden stalks beneath the summer sun. Now that careful work rested safely upon the deck of a riverboat. Its journey had become another person's responsibility. The farmer felt quietly satisfied. Not proud. Not emotional. Simply content. The season had been kind. He would return home with enough grain for his family. Enough seed for another planting. Enough to exchange for tools, cloth, and perhaps that little carved toy he had remembered while walking to town. He nodded once toward the boatman. The boatman returned the greeting. No long farewell was needed. Tomorrow another farmer would arrive. Another harvest. Another quiet exchange. The rhythm never truly stopped. The farmer turned away. His donkey waited patiently beneath a sycamore tree. Only an empty wooden carrying frame rested across its back now. It seemed lighter. The animal stretched its neck before following its owner back toward the dusty road leading home. Soon they disappeared among other travelers. The grain sack would never see them again. Still, part of the farmer's season would continue traveling long after his own footsteps faded from the road. Late in the morning, the breeze strengthened. It came first as a gentle touch across the surface of the river. Small ripples spread outward. The reeds along the shoreline leaned slightly. The folded sail stirred once more. This time the movement was unmistakable. The older boatman smiled. "It is time." The crew stood together. Two sailors untied the ropes holding the sail. Another steadied the mast. The heavy linen unfolded slowly. Its broad surface caught the growing wind with a soft, deep sound. The sail filled gently. Not suddenly. Gradually. Like a great breath being taken. The boat shifted against its mooring ropes. The hull creaked quietly. Water curled softly around the bow. The captain gave a calm instruction. The thick ropes tying the boat to the dock were loosened. One after another they slipped free from the wooden posts. A sailor coiled each rope neatly instead of leaving it upon the deck. Good habits mattered. The long steering oar dipped into the water. Another sailor used a broad pole to push gently against the muddy riverbank. The boat moved only a hand's width at first. Then another. The river welcomed it without resistance. The dock slowly drifted farther away. Workers standing ashore raised quiet hands in farewell. The crew answered with small waves. No shouting crossed the water. Only gentle smiles. The town began to grow smaller. The storehouse walls became shorter against the bright sky. Palm trees blended into green lines beside the river. Smoke from morning ovens rose in thin gray ribbons before disappearing into the blue above. The grain sack remained perfectly still among the carefully arranged cargo. Beneath it, the wooden deck gave the faintest, gentlest motion as the boat settled into the slow embrace of the Nile. The journey by road had ended. Now another kind of travel had begun. There would be no dusty footsteps. No donkey hooves. No winding village paths. Only the steady whisper of water sliding past the hull, the quiet breathing of the wind within the sail, and the peaceful rhythm of the ancient river carrying one humble sack of barley farther into the heart of Egypt. The town slowly slipped behind the boat. At first, the buildings remained easy to see. The thick storehouse walls stood above the smaller homes. The docks stretched into the river. Palm trees marked the shoreline with soft green shapes that moved gently whenever the breeze touched their leaves. Little by little, the distance grew. The voices from the dock faded until they became impossible to hear. The smell of fresh bread no longer reached the boat. Soon the town became only another quiet place resting beside the Nile, much like many others waiting farther ahead. The boat settled comfortably into its journey. The sail remained full. Not stretched tightly, but filled with a calm, steady wind that carried the vessel northward without effort. The water slipped past the wooden hull with a soft whisper that never seemed to stop. It was a peaceful sound. One that every boatman came to know well. Some said they could sleep while listening to it. Others said they noticed its absence more than its presence. After many years upon the Nile, the gentle voice of moving water became part of everyday life. The grain sack rested where it had been carefully placed. Around it lay dozens of other sacks. Some touched its sides. Others rested only a short distance away. Between them, folded reed mats softened every small movement of the boat. Nothing shifted. Nothing rubbed roughly against anything else. The older boatman had loaded the cargo well. He stood near the steering oar at the stern. His hands rested lightly upon the smooth wood. He did not need to force the boat. Only small corrections were necessary now and then. The Nile knew its own path. His task was simply to guide the vessel gently along it. The younger sailors moved quietly across the deck. One adjusted a loose rope. Another checked the edge of the sail. A third swept away a little dust that had collected near the bow before it mixed with the morning dew. Every task was done without haste. The river rewarded patience. There was little reason to rush. The breeze remained kind. The current remained steady. The day had only begun. Along the eastern bank, fields stretched away from the river in long green bands. Barley had already been harvested in many places. Now other crops filled the land. Vegetable gardens spread beside irrigation channels. Rows of onions pushed green leaves toward the sky. Flax plants swayed gently in the breeze. Children walked carefully between the narrow paths carrying small woven baskets almost as large as themselves. Some gathered vegetables. Others pulled tiny weeds growing where they did not belong. Nearby, their mothers worked quietly beneath broad straw hats woven from river reeds. They spoke softly as their hands continued moving. A few laughed. The sound floated briefly across the water before disappearing into the morning air. Farther inland, several oxen pulled wooden plows through dark soil still moist from recent irrigation. The animals walked slowly. Each step pressed deeply into the earth. Behind them, farmers guided the simple plows with practiced hands. The work demanded strength. Yet there was no struggle in their movements. Only steady effort. One furrow after another. The fields seemed endless. Each one belonged to another family. Another season. Another story. The grain sack had begun its life in one such field. Now it passed many others that looked wonderfully familiar. The river curved gently. The boat followed without resistance. Reeds grew thick along the muddy banks. Tall papyrus plants reached above the water, their feathery tops moving together whenever the wind changed. Dragonflies danced among them, their delicate wings flashing silver beneath the bright sun. A turtle lifted its head briefly above the surface before slipping silently beneath the water once again. White herons stood perfectly still near the shore. They waited with endless patience. Occasionally one took a careful step. Then another. Its reflection moved with it upon the calm water. Suddenly the bird lowered its long beak. A tiny fish disappeared. Then stillness returned. Everything beside the Nile seemed comfortable with waiting. The boat itself moved so gently that the cargo barely noticed. The wooden hull rose and settled with small ripples. The motion became almost like breathing. Slow. Even. Predictable. One sailor sat cross-legged beneath the shade cast by the folded edge of the sail. He was repairing a woven basket. Several reeds had broken near the handle. Patiently he removed the damaged pieces. Fresh reeds soaked earlier in river water rested beside him. While damp, they bent easily. His fingers wove them through the older reeds. Over. Under. Pull gently. Straighten. Repeat. The basket slowly became whole again. Nothing was thrown away unless it truly could not be repaired. A good basket deserved many years of use. Near him, another sailor sharpened a small bronze knife using a smooth stone. He did not hurry the work. Long, careful strokes passed across the blade. After every few moments he held the knife toward the sunlight. Satisfied with its edge, he rubbed a little oil across the bronze before placing it back into its leather cover. The older captain watched quietly. He approved of sailors who cared for their tools. Well-kept tools rarely caused trouble. The river widened slightly. Here the breeze grew stronger. The sail filled more fully. The boat leaned only a little. Not enough to disturb the cargo. Only enough to remind everyone that the wind had become a willing companion. The younger sailors smiled. Good wind meant easier travel. One of them began humming softly while coiling another length of rope. It was not a song performed for anyone. Simply a familiar tune remembered from childhood. Another sailor recognized it and quietly joined him. Their voices remained low, almost blending with the sound of the water. No one seemed to mind. The melody drifted across the deck before disappearing into the open river. The grain sack rested peacefully beneath the warm sunlight. The linen cloth had dried completely after the coolness of the night. Its rough fibers smelled faintly of harvested barley and clean dust from the farmer's fields. A tiny feather carried by the breeze landed briefly upon the sack before lifting away once more. Clouds drifted lazily overhead. They were small, thin, barely enough to soften the sunlight for more than a few moments at a time. Even so, whenever one passed before the sun, the air seemed pleasantly cooler. The crew welcomed those brief moments without saying anything. By the middle of the morning, another boat appeared farther down the river. It traveled south. Its broad sail caught the wind from the opposite direction while several rowers helped guide it against the current. As the two boats approached each other, both captains raised a hand in greeting. The gesture was simple, friendly, ordinary. When they drew close enough, one captain called across the water, "Peace upon your journey. And upon yours." The words crossed the river gently. Then both boats continued in opposite directions. Within only a few moments, they were drifting farther apart. Soon each became a small shape against the shining water. The Nile connected countless towns and villages. Boatmen often recognized one another after many seasons. Sometimes they met only once each year. Sometimes more often. The river quietly brought old acquaintances together again and again. As noon slowly approached, the warmth increased. The sailors tied an extra strip of woven cloth along one side of the cargo to create a little shade. Not because the grain required it. The sacks were strong enough. Instead, the shaded space offered the crew a comfortable place to rest whenever their tasks were finished. One sailor sat there for a while, leaning against a grain sack. His eyes followed the slow movement of the shoreline. Date palms, fields, mud brick homes, children waving from the riverbank, goats drinking near the water's edge. Everything passed by without hurry. He smiled quietly. After so many journeys, the scenery remained familiar. Yet it never became tiresome. Every season painted the valley a little differently. Every village carried its own peaceful rhythm. Every harvest gave the river another reason to remain busy. The grain sack continued its calm voyage, carried by steady wind, careful hands, and the timeless current of the Nile, while ahead, beyond the next gentle bend in the river, another quiet landing place waited patiently, ready to welcome boats just as it had welcomed them for generations beyond memory. The boat followed the wide curve of the Nile with quiet confidence. From the deck, the river seemed almost endless. Its surface changed from deep blue to soft green wherever the sunlight touched it at different angles. Small ripples spread gently away from the bow, meeting the shore in tiny waves that disappeared among reeds and smooth stones. The grain sack remained comfortably in its place. It had now become familiar with the gentle motion beneath it. The slight rise and fall of the boat no longer felt new. The quiet creaking of wooden planks blended with the whisper of the sail and the soft sound of water slipping past the hull. Together, these sounds formed a calm rhythm that seemed to belong only to the river. The captain stood near the stern as he always did. His eyes rarely stayed in one place for very long. He watched the sail, then the water, then the distant shoreline, then the clouds. Years on the Nile had taught him that every part of the river spoke in its own silent language. The wind could change. The current could shift. A sandbank might appear where deep water had flowed only months before. Careful observation was part of every journey. He never seemed worried. Only attentive. Nearby, one of the younger sailors untied a small linen bundle. Inside rested his midday meal. A round loaf of barley bread. A handful of dried figs. 2 onions. A small piece of salted fish wrapped carefully inside another piece of cloth. He broke the bread slowly. Not because it was difficult. Simply because there was no need to hurry. Another sailor joined him. They shared the meal without counting who received the larger piece. On the river, such sharing was ordinary. Tomorrow another sailor might open his own bundle first. The older captain accepted only a little bread and a few dates. He had learned over many years that heavy meals made long afternoons feel even warmer. He drank from the cool clay water jar instead. The jar rested beneath damp cloth where the breeze could reach it. Tiny drops of moisture covered its outer surface. The water inside remained pleasantly cool despite the growing heat. After drinking, he carefully replaced the cloth. Small acts of care helped everyone aboard. The riverbank slowly unfolded beside them. Here the land grew slightly wider before reaching the desert beyond. Fields stretched away in orderly patterns divided by narrow irrigation channels. The dark soil looked rich against the pale sand farther inland. Workers moved steadily between the rows. From the boat they appeared very small. Tiny figures bending, standing, walking, then bending again. Even at this distance, their routines were easy to recognize. One group harvested bundles of flax. Another repaired a broken canal wall where water had begun escaping into a low patch of ground. Children carried woven baskets filled with vegetables toward waiting donkeys. Nothing seemed hurried. Every task followed another with quiet certainty. The grain sack watched these familiar landscapes pass. Though it could not think, its own story belonged to this same valley. Every sack aboard the boat had begun somewhere beside these fertile banks. Each had once been only scattered seeds resting beneath warm soil. The river connected them all. Not far ahead, several fishermen stood waist-deep in shallow water near the edge of the reeds. Instead of boats, they used long woven traps placed carefully where fish often passed. One man slowly lifted a trap from the water. Silver fish flashed briefly in the sunlight before settling into a basket. His son stood nearby holding another empty trap. The boy watched every movement with patient attention. Learning came quietly. Not through long speeches, but through watching, trying, repeating. The same pattern appeared everywhere along the Nile. A daughter learned bread making beside her mother. A son learned farming beside his father. An apprentice learned writing beside a scribe. A young sailor learned the river beside an older captain. Knowledge moved from one pair of hands to another. Slowly. Naturally. Without anyone calling it remarkable. The breeze freshened for a little while. The sail filled more completely. The boat moved a little faster, though not enough for anyone aboard to notice immediately. Only the shoreline drifted by a touch more quickly. The captain looked upward. He seemed pleased. He adjusted the angle of the steering oar only slightly. The younger sailors trusted him completely. No discussion was needed. They simply continued their work. Near the middle of the deck, one sailor checked the grain sacks once again. He walked carefully between them, pressing lightly against the linen, looking at the clay seals, making certain nothing had shifted. When he reached the familiar sack from the farmer's village, he rested his hand briefly against the rough cloth. Everything remained exactly as it should. He smiled quietly before moving on. The inspection finished almost as soon as it had begun. A small flock of ducks flew low across the river. Their wings beat steadily above the water. For a few moments, their reflections traveled beside them. Then they disappeared among thick reeds farther downstream. One sailor followed them with his eyes until they were gone. "They know where they are going," he said softly. The older captain nodded. "So does the river." The younger man smiled. The conversation ended there. Silence returned. It was a comfortable silence. No one felt the need to fill every moment with words. The Nile offered enough to watch. Enough to hear. Enough to think about. By the middle of the day, the sun stood high above the valley. Its light fell almost straight down. The shadows beneath the sail became especially welcome. The sailors worked more slowly now. Not because they were lazy. Only because long experience had taught them to save their strength during the hottest hours. One man dampened a piece of linen with cool water and wrapped it loosely around his neck. Another poured a little water over his hands before returning to coiling rope. The captain removed his sandals for a few moments. The wooden deck felt warm beneath his feet, but not uncomfortably so. He stretched his toes. Then quietly slipped the sandals back on. Far ahead, the outline of another riverside village slowly appeared. At first it was only a few palm trees rising above the horizon. Then came the flat roofs of mud brick homes. A small dock. Several fishing boats pulled onto the shore. Thin lines of smoke drifted upward where midday meals were being prepared. The village looked peaceful. Very much like the one the grain sack had left behind. Children ran along the riverbank chasing one another between clusters of reeds. A pair of donkeys stood beneath the shade of a sycamore tree, flicking their tails lazily. Women rinsed linen cloth in the shallows before spreading it across smooth stones to dry in the sun. Old men sat together beneath a woven shelter repairing fishing nets. Everything moved at an unhurried pace. The captain studied the village. "We will stop here." His words were calm. Matter of fact. The younger sailors nodded. This stop had been planned before the journey even began. Some of the grain aboard would continue farther north. Some would remain here. Every village depended upon the steady movement of food along the river. The boat gradually moved closer to the shore. The sail was loosened slightly. Its pole softened. Two sailors picked up long wooden poles and stood ready near the bow. The water grew shallower. The captain guided the boat carefully between patches of reeds. The hull barely disturbed the quiet surface. A kingfisher darted from a nearby branch, flashing brilliant blue for only an instant before disappearing downstream. The village dock came slowly into view. It was simple. Wooden posts driven firmly into the muddy bank. Planks weathered smooth by countless footsteps. Several men waited there already. Not impatiently. Simply ready. One held a folded sheet of papyrus. Another carried a measuring rod. A third shaded his eyes with one hand as the approaching boat drifted gently toward the landing. The grain sack rested quietly among the carefully arranged cargo. It did not yet know whether this peaceful village would become its next resting place or whether its journey would carry it farther along the timeless Nile. For now, it waited in the warm afternoon light as the boat slowed almost to a whisper, the hull gliding across the calm water toward another ordinary stop in the long and gentle journey of a single grain sack. The boat approached the dock so gently that the water hardly seemed to notice. Small ripples spread outward from the bow, reaching the muddy bank before quietly disappearing among clusters of reeds. The sail, which had carried the vessel steadily throughout the morning, slowly relaxed as the crew loosened its ropes. The broad linen cloth no longer pulled firmly against the wind. Instead, it fluttered softly, its movement slow and graceful beneath the warm afternoon sky. The captain rested one hand upon the long steering oar. His eyes remained fixed upon the landing. He had visited this village many times over the years. The river changed little from season to season, yet every approach deserved careful attention. Sandbanks could move. Fallen branches might drift near the shore. Water levels rose and fell with the rhythm of the Nile. Experience had taught him never to assume yesterday's path would always remain today's path. Two sailors stepped quietly toward the front of the boat. Each held a long wooden pole polished smooth by many journeys. As the boat drifted closer, they lowered the poles into the shallow riverbed. The wood touched soft mud beneath the water. With slow, steady pressure they guided the boat gently away from a patch of reeds. No splashing. No hurried movement. Only patient strength. The hull answered with a quiet creak. A few moments later, the bow rested beside the dock. One sailor stepped lightly onto the weathered planks carrying a thick mooring rope. He wrapped it once around a sturdy wooden post. Then again. The knot came naturally to his hands. He had tied the same knot hundreds of times. Perhaps thousands. The rope tightened. The boat became still. The river continued flowing beneath it. The journey paused. The grain sack rested exactly where it had been placed that morning. Around it, the other sacks remained neat and orderly. Nothing had shifted during the voyage. The older captain allowed himself a small smile. Careful loading had rewarded careful travel. A village official walked slowly toward the boat. He wore simple linen clothing, clean but plainly woven. Beneath one arm rested a rolled sheet of papyrus. Behind him came a younger assistant carrying a wooden writing pallet and several fresh reed pens. The captain greeted them warmly. "Peace to your village. And peace to your journey." Their voices remained calm. No one raised them above the gentle sounds of the river. The official unrolled the papyrus upon a small wooden table placed beneath a woven shade. The breeze lifted one corner before his assistant gently held it flat. The list contained careful records. How many grain sacks were expected? Which villages had sent them? Which storehouses would receive them? Nothing was left to memory alone. The captain removed his own rolled records from a leather pouch. Together the two men compared each line. They paused often. Not because anything was wrong. Simply because accuracy deserved patience. The assistant dipped his reed pen into black ink. Every completed entry received another neat mark. Nearby, several village laborers waited beneath the shade of a sycamore tree. Each man carried a wooden shoulder pole much like those used at the previous storehouse. Some leaned quietly against the trunk. Others drank cool water from a large clay jar resting in the shade. They knew their work would begin soon. There was no reason to hurry before the records were complete. The afternoon breeze rustled softly through the broad leaves overhead. Tiny patches of sunlight danced upon the ground. A pair of children watched from a respectful distance. One held a small basket filled with figs. The younger child pointed quietly toward the large boat. He had probably seen boats before. Even so, watching cargo arrive remained interesting. The older child whispered something. Both smiled. Then they wandered away toward their mother, who waited nearby with folded linen cloth spread across a smooth rock to dry. Life continued all around the dock. A fisherman untangled his nets while sitting cross-legged beneath another tree. His fingers moved steadily. Loop by loop. Knot by knot. He rarely looked down. His hands knew exactly what they were doing. Farther along the shore, two women washed clay jars in the shallow water. They laughed softly together as they worked. The sound drifted gently across the river before fading into the afternoon air. Goats searched for tender leaves beneath scattered palms. A donkey stood quietly chewing dry grass near the edge of the village path. Everything felt unhurried. The Nile encouraged such rhythms. At last the village official nodded. The records agree. The captain smiled. Good. The assistant rolled the completed papyrus carefully. Fresh cord tied it closed. Another small task finished. The laborers stepped forward. The older captain unfolded a second list. Only a portion of the grain would remain here. The rest would continue north after the boat had been lightened. He quietly called the numbers. The workers listened carefully. One pair climbed aboard carrying a polished shoulder pole. They walked between the neatly stacked sacks without disturbing the others. The captain pointed gently. Those three. The men nodded. Together they bent their knees. Strong hands gripped rough linen. The first sack rose smoothly. Its weight settled evenly across the pole. The second followed. Then the third. The grain sack watched them leave. Soon they disappeared down the gangplank toward the dock. Their footsteps remained slow and steady. No grain spilled. No cloth tore. The sacks reached the shore safely. There they were lowered onto woven reed mats while another official checked each clay seal. Everything remained intact. The unloading continued. One pair of workers carried sacks away. Another returned empty. Back and forth. Again and again. The movement became almost peaceful to watch. Step. Lift. Walk. Lower. Return. No voice needed to command the rhythm. Years of shared work had created it naturally. Our grain sack remained aboard. Its clay seal matched a destination farther north. Its journey was not yet finished. The captain knew this before the voyage had even begun. He glanced once toward the familiar sack. Then returned to supervising the unloading. As the pile slowly became smaller, more space appeared across the wooden deck. Sunlight reached planks hidden since morning. A sailor swept away bits of loose straw left beneath several sacks. Another straightened the reed mats protecting the remaining cargo. Small acts of order filled the quiet pauses between heavier work. The village storehouse stood only a short distance from the dock. Its walls looked much like those farther south. Thick mud bricks. Few windows. A broad wooden doorway. As each unloaded sack disappeared inside, another chapter of its own quiet journey began. Some grain would become flour within days. Some might remain safely stored until the next season. Some would be exchanged for cloth, tools, or oil. Every sack carried possibilities. Every sack would eventually become someone's meal. By late afternoon the work slowed. Only the cargo continuing north remained aboard. The deck looked more open now. The boat floated a little higher in the water. The captain noticed immediately. He always noticed. He walked slowly among the remaining sacks. One by one he checked their positions. A lighter boat balanced differently. A few sacks needed moving. Only a little. A hand's width here. A shoulder's width there. The sailors worked together quietly. They shifted the grain with practiced care until the weight rested evenly once more. The grain sack moved only slightly. Just enough to settle comfortably beside two companions that would share the next stage of the journey. The captain stepped back. He looked across the deck. Then toward the river. Then up at the sail. The afternoon breeze still flowed steadily from the south. Good. There would be time to continue before evening. On the shore, the village official raised a hand. Our thanks. And ours, the captain replied. The mooring rope was loosened once more. The knot slipped free with ease. A sailor coiled the rope neatly over one shoulder. The poles touched the riverbed again. With gentle pressure, the boat drifted away from the dock. The distance between shore and hull slowly widened. The villagers became smaller. Children waved. The sailors answered with quiet smiles. Soon the dock was only another peaceful place along the endless ribbon of the Nile. The grain sack rested once more upon the gently moving deck. Behind it lay another village where ordinary people would bake bread, prepare evening meals, and settle into sleep beneath the cooling desert sky. Ahead waited more bends in the river, more quiet landings, more patient hands, and many more peaceful miles carried by the calm current that had connected the lives of countless ordinary Egyptians for generations beyond memory. The village slowly faded behind the boat. For a time, the tops of the palm trees remained visible above the riverbank. Then they too disappeared behind a bend in the Nile, leaving only open water, distant fields, and the wide Egyptian sky. The afternoon had begun its gradual journey toward evening. The sunlight no longer fell directly from above. Instead, it stretched across the valley at a softer angle, painting the water with long bands of gold that drifted and shimmered with every small movement of the river. The boat moved steadily onward. Its sail remained full. The breeze that had carried it throughout the day still flowed gently from the south. Not strong enough to strain the ropes. Not weak enough to slow the journey. It was the kind of wind boatmen appreciated most. The captain stood quietly at the stern. One hand rested upon the steering oar. His face showed the calm expression of a man who had spent much of his life upon the river. He knew this stretch of water well. He knew where the shoreline curved. He knew where fishermen often set their traps. He knew which villages appeared after certain bends in the river and which landmarks became visible long before a settlement itself could be seen. The Nile had become almost like an old companion. Reliable. Familiar. Never exactly the same. Yet never truly strange. The grain sack rested peacefully among the remaining cargo. Its companions now seemed fewer after the unloading. More space surrounded the sacks. The deck felt open. Air moved more freely between the rows. The scent of dry barley mixed softly with the smells of river water, rope fibers, warm wood, and the occasional breath of wind carrying distant cooking fires from unseen villages. One sailor sat beside the cargo repairing a tear in a small linen bag. The damage was minor. A few loose stitches. Nothing more. Still, he preferred to mend it immediately. A problem solved early rarely became a larger one later. His bronze needle moved carefully through the cloth. Pull. Tighten. Pull again. The work required little thought. His hands had repeated these motions many times before. Nearby, another sailor polished a wooden paddle with smooth river sand. The paddle was not needed often. Most of the journey relied upon wind and current. Even so, every tool aboard deserved care. The sailor rubbed the wood slowly. Fine dust gathered beneath his fingers. When finished, he brushed the paddle clean and leaned it carefully against the side of the boat. The older captain noticed. He nodded with quiet approval. Good habits pleased him. The river widened again. Along the western bank, broad fields stretched toward the desert beyond. From a distance, workers appeared as tiny figures moving through patches of green and gold. Some guided donkeys along narrow paths. Others carried baskets balanced across their shoulders. Several stood ankle-deep in irrigation channels repairing small sections of crumbling earth. The work looked endless. Yet every worker focused only upon the task immediately before them. A broken wall. A thirsty field. A basket needing transport. One small responsibility at a time. That was how most lives along the Nile unfolded. Not through grand events, but through countless ordinary tasks repeated day after day. The grain sack itself existed because of such routines. A farmer had risen before dawn. A family had harvested carefully. Workers had measured the grain. Scribes had recorded it. Laborers had carried it. Boatmen now guided it onward. No single step seemed remarkable. Together they created a journey stretching across the valley. The afternoon breeze carried new scents. The sailors noticed them immediately. One lifted his head slightly. Another smiled. Fresh bread. Somewhere ahead, ovens were busy. The smell drifted across the water before the village itself appeared. Soon thin lines of smoke became visible above the trees. Then came the first rooftops. Mud brick homes clustered near the river. Children played along the shoreline. Several women filled water jars at a small landing place. A pair of fishermen cleaned their catch beside overturned boats pulled onto the bank. The grain boat did not stop. The captain had no deliveries scheduled there. Still, everyone aboard glanced toward the village as they passed. People on the shore raised friendly hands. The sailors returned the greeting. The distance between them remained too great for conversation. Only smiles traveled across the water. Within minutes the village drifted behind them. Another peaceful place. Another ordinary day unfolding beside the Nile. As the sun lowered further, shadows lengthened. Palm trees cast dark reflections across the water. Birds began returning to their evening resting places. White herons crossed the river in slow, graceful flight. A flock of ducks schemed low above the surface before disappearing into a marshy inlet. The river itself seemed calmer now. Not because the current had changed. Rather because the heat of midday had begun to fade. The air felt softer. The light gentler. One sailor opened a small woven basket containing dates. He offered them to the others. Each man took only a few. The fruit was sweet. Simple. Familiar. The captain accepted one date and ate it slowly while studying the river ahead. He chewed thoughtfully. Not because anything concerned him. Only because long hours upon the water encouraged quiet reflection. Perhaps he thought about previous journeys. Perhaps he considered tomorrow's destination. Or perhaps he simply enjoyed the evening. The younger sailors rarely asked. Everyone aboard understood that silence could be comfortable. No one felt obligated to fill every moment with words. The river offered enough company. Far ahead, the shoreline narrowed slightly. The captain recognized the place immediately. A small island rested in the middle of the Nile. Not large. Only a patch of green surrounded by shallow channels. Several date palms grew there. So did reeds and low shrubs where birds often nested. The island appeared every year. During seasons of higher water, it became smaller. During lower water, it seemed larger. The sailors knew it well. Many travelers paused nearby during long journeys. Not because the island itself offered much. Simply because the surrounding water remained calm and sheltered. The captain watched the sky. The sun had begun its slow descent toward the western horizon. Orange light touched the tops of the palms. Soon evening would arrive. He considered the distance still ahead. Then he made his decision. We stop near the island tonight. No one objected. The choice seemed sensible. The crew would rest. The boat would continue at first light. The grain would remain safe. The river would still be there in the morning. The younger sailors immediately began their quiet preparations. One checked the mooring ropes. Another examined the stone anchor resting near the bow. A third gathered several small oil lamps from a storage chest. None of this work required urgency. There was still plenty of daylight remaining. The boat continued gliding toward the island. Its reflection stretched across the water. Birds moved among the reeds. One kingfisher flashed blue and silver before vanishing into the gathering shadows. The grain sack rested calmly among the cargo. The day had carried it farther from the farmer's field than ever before. Yet the journey remained peaceful. No storms. No accidents. No difficulties. Only steady wind. Gentle water. Patient hands. The same simple ingredients that had carried grain, people, and stories along the Nile for countless generations. As the sun slowly approached the horizon and the island grew larger ahead, the boat drifted onward through the golden evening light, preparing to spend another quiet night beneath the ancient Egyptian sky while the humble grain sack waited patiently for the next morning and the next chapter of its long, unhurried journey. The island grew larger with every quiet moment. It was not a grand place. No tall temples stood among its palms. No busy market filled its shoreline with voices. It was simply a gentle rise of earth resting peacefully in the middle of the Nile, shaped year after year by the patient work of flowing water. A small stand of date palms leaned toward the river. Their leaves moved softly in the evening breeze, making a sound like distant whispering. Thick reeds surrounded much of the shoreline, where small birds disappeared into hidden nests before nightfall. The captain guided the boat toward the sheltered side of the island. Here the current slowed. The water became almost perfectly smooth. Only the smallest ripples touched the wooden hull. The sail, which had carried the boat faithfully throughout the day, gradually lost its shape as the evening wind became lighter. Its broad linen cloth sagged gently. The younger sailors loosened the ropes. With practiced hands they lowered the sail little by little. No part of the heavy cloth fell suddenly. Every movement remained controlled. The long folds settled neatly across the boom. Another sailor tied each section carefully with soft rope. Tomorrow morning it would be raised again. For now, it deserved its own quiet rest. The boat drifted the final few lengths toward the shore. One sailor stepped forward carrying the stone anchor. The stone had been smoothed by many years of use. A thick rope passed securely through a carefully carved opening. The captain looked once toward the shoreline. Satisfied with the depth of the water, he nodded. The sailor lowered the anchor slowly. There was no splash. Only a quiet sound as the stone slipped beneath the surface. The rope tightened gently. The boat settled into place. The journey paused once more. The river continued flowing around it without interruption. Even when people stopped to rest, the Nile never did. The grain sack remained exactly where it had rested throughout the afternoon. Its linen cloth glowed softly beneath the warm evening light. The sun now hung low above the western hills. Its golden light reached across the water until the entire river seemed painted with bronze. Every ripple carried a different shade of color. Some reflected gold. Others orange. A few appeared almost purple where shadows from the palms stretched across the current. One by one, the sailors began their evening routines. There was no shouting. No hurried instructions. Each man already knew his responsibilities. One checked every mooring rope. He tugged gently on each knot. Satisfied, he moved to the next. Another sailor walked slowly around the cargo. His hands rested briefly against several grain sacks. He made certain that none had shifted during the day's voyage. When he reached the familiar sack from the southern village, he smiled quietly. Everything remained secure. The clay seal still rested firmly against the cord. Nothing had changed. That was exactly as it should be. Near the stern, the oldest sailor opened a small wooden chest. Inside rested simple cooking pots blackened by many fires. He removed one carefully. Another sailor gathered a few bundles of dry reeds and small pieces of driftwood collected earlier along the riverbank. Soon a tiny cooking fire burned safely inside a shallow clay basin placed upon a bed of sand aboard the boat. The flame remained small. Just enough to warm the evening meal. Smoke rose slowly into the still air. Its scent mixed with the fresh smell of the river. The meal was modest. A clay pot held lentils cooked with onions and a few herbs. Another basket contained round loaves of barley bread baked that morning. Several dried fish rested upon a woven mat. One sailor sliced cucumbers gathered from a riverside garden before the journey had begun. Fresh dates completed the meal. Nothing was elaborate. Everything was welcome. The crew gathered together quietly. They sat wherever they found comfortable places upon the deck. Some leaned against the cargo. Others rested near the mast. The captain accepted his bowl last. He always did. Not because anyone expected it. Simply because it had become his habit over many years. The men ate slowly. The day's work had earned them peaceful hunger. Conversation came and went gently. One sailor spoke about his young daughter, who had recently learned to weave small baskets from river reeds. Another wondered whether the flood waters might arrive a little earlier this year. The oldest sailor remembered a season many years before when unusually strong winds had carried his boat farther in a single day than anyone expected. No one interrupted. Stories flowed as quietly as the river itself. When bowls became empty, one younger sailor poured fresh water from the cool clay jar. The water tasted clean. The jar had spent the day wrapped in damp cloth beneath the shade of the remaining cargo. Even after hours beneath the warm sky, it remained pleasantly cool. As evening deepened, birds settled among the island's reeds. Their songs became fewer. One by one they grew silent. A pair of ibises glided low above the water before disappearing behind the palms. Farther away, ducks gathered into close groups near sheltered pools. The island slowly prepared for another peaceful night. The river changed as well. Its bright afternoon colors softened into gentle silver. The first stars appeared overhead. Tiny reflections shimmered upon the water. The line between river and sky became difficult to see. The captain stood for a while near the bow. He looked north. Tomorrow's journey waited beyond the darkness. He knew the villages ahead. The narrow channels. The broad stretches where the wind often became stronger. He had traveled this route so many times that he could almost picture every bend before reaching it. Still, each journey remained slightly different. The river always offered small surprises. Never dramatic ones. Only gentle reminders that water was always moving. Always changing. Behind him, the younger sailors finished washing the cooking bowls. They used only a little river water. Nothing was wasted. The bowls were dried with linen cloth before returning to the wooden chest. The cooking fire slowly faded. Red coals glowed softly for a while before becoming dark. The night breeze grew cooler. One sailor spread a woven reed mat across the deck. Another unrolled a folded linen blanket. Most of the crew would sleep aboard the boat. They preferred it that way. The gentle rocking of the river had become familiar over the years. Many said they slept better upon the water than they did upon dry land. The grain sack rested peacefully beneath the stars. Around it, the remaining cargo formed quiet shapes in the moonlight. The mast rose above them like a dark line against the sky. The folded sail hung motionless. Its long day of catching the wind had ended. Across the narrow stretch of water, the island remained almost silent. Only the breeze moved through the palms. Only the reeds whispered softly along the shore. Now and then a fish disturbed the smooth surface with a gentle splash before silence returned once more. The captain lay down upon his woven mat. His hands rested comfortably across his chest. He looked upward for a few moments. The stars seemed countless. He knew many of them by heart. They had guided his journeys for years. Slowly, his eyes grew heavy. One by one, the sounds of the boat became softer. Breathing. Water touching wood. A loose rope moving gently against the mast. Nothing more. The grain sack waited patiently through another quiet Egyptian night, surrounded by calm water, sleeping boatmen, and the endless stars above the Nile, knowing only the peaceful stillness before another gentle morning would once again carry it farther along its long and ordinary journey. The eastern sky would brighten again, just as it always had. The island would wake to the quiet songs of birds hidden among the reeds. The boatmen would rise, fold their sleeping mats, share simple bread and cool water, and lift the great linen sail once more. The gentle wind would return, the ropes would tighten, and the boat would continue its patient path along the Nile. The humble grain sack would travel a little farther. Perhaps it would reach another riverside town. Perhaps it would rest in another cool storehouse. Perhaps careful millers would one day pour its barley into smooth stone mills, where steady hands would turn grain into fine flour. The flour would become warm dough. The dough would become bread. A baker would press each round loaf with quiet confidence before placing it inside a glowing clay oven. The smell of fresh bread would drift through narrow streets in the cool hours of morning, inviting workers beginning another ordinary day. One loaf might be carried home by a fisherman returning from the river. Another might become the midday meal of a farmer repairing an irrigation channel beneath the warm Egyptian sun. A builder shaping stone with slow, careful strikes might pause beneath a patch of shade to share bread with a friend. A mother might divide a loaf into equal pieces for waiting children seated upon woven mats inside a cool mud brick home. An elderly scribe, after hours of writing careful records upon papyrus, might break off a small piece to enjoy with onions and a cup of cool water. No one would know the path that single grain sack had taken. No one would remember the patient donkey that carried it from the village. No one would think of the farmer who planted the tiny seeds months before the harvest. Few would imagine the careful scribes, the quiet laborers, the steady boatmen, or the peaceful nights spent beneath endless stars beside the Nile. Yet every ordinary hand had quietly become part of the same story. The farmer trusted the earth. The earth trusted the river. The river carried the harvest. The harvest fed the people. And the people, through countless simple routines repeated across generations, carried Egypt gently forward from one season to the next. There were no great celebrations for a single sack of barley. No statues were carved in its honor. No songs were written about its long journey. Its importance lived in quieter places. In warm kitchens before sunrise. In the smell of bread filling narrow streets. In tired workers finding strength after a simple meal. In children falling asleep with full stomachs beneath flat rooftops cooled by the evening breeze. Sometimes the greatest stories belong not to kings, but to the countless ordinary things that quietly hold a civilization together. A woven basket. A clay jar. A reed pen. A wooden boat. A patient donkey. A careful pair of hands. And one humble grain sack making its slow journey along the timeless Nile. Now the river grows quiet once more. The last light has faded beyond the western hills. The palms stand peacefully against the night sky. The reeds whisper softly where the gentle current brushes past their roots. Oil lamps become fewer. Cooking fires settle into glowing embers. Voices drift away one by one until only the calm breathing of the ancient world remains. The boat rests beneath the stars. The water continues its endless journey. The wind grows gentle. Above, the constellations that watched over farmers, sailors, scribes, and families for thousands of years shine with the same quiet patience they always have. Everything slows. Everything softens. The Nile flows without hurry. The desert breathes beneath the cool night air. And somewhere in the peaceful darkness of ancient Egypt, history becomes wonderfully ordinary once again. So let the river carry away the last thoughts of the day. Let the whisper of reeds replace every worry. Let the steady rhythm of calm water become softer, and softer, until it is little more than a quiet memory. And beneath the endless Egyptian stars, where the timeless Nile continues its gentle journey through the sleeping land, the ancient world rests peacefully through the night.